Hey guys, tonight we set sail into the soft, wine-drenched mists of Greek myth, following the trail of a very handsome, very mysterious man who once turned a bunch of nosy pirates into dolphins. You're walking down a lonely beach at dusk, the tide just kissing your ankles when you spot him, a tall figure in a flowing purple cloak, resting against a rock. Like he owns the place, which as it turns out, he just might. His hair curls like ivy. His skin gleams like honey in fading light. And there's something about the way he watches the waves, like they're old friends. You think surely he's lost, or famous, or possibly both. Either way, you probably won't survive this encounter, but hey, let's see where it goes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sea smells saltier here, heavier. You trail behind the man at a safe distance, listening to the crunch of damp sand beneath your feet. Everything feels too quiet. There are no gulls. The sky's gone from gold to bruised plum. Somewhere a ship creaks in the distance. You hear them before you see them, rowdy voices, rough laughter, the clinking of cups. A ship is anchored not far off the coast, its crew watching the shore with interest. They've spotted the man too. And unlike you, they're not curious in a respectful, dreamy wanderer kind of way. They're pirates. And when pirates see someone glittery and out of place, especially barefoot and unarmed, they start thinking in terms of loot and ransom. One particularly scruffy sailor, the kind who's probably lost count of his tattoos, points to the shore. He's dressed too fine to be local, he says. We take him, we get paid. Or maybe he's got gold on him. No one argues. That's pirate democracy for you. They lower a rowboat splashing toward the beach with gleaming eyes and no moral compass. You back into the shadows of a dune, hoping not to be seen. The man doesn't move, doesn't even flinch. He watches the boat come in as if it's a dolphin itself, which is, let's just say, a little on the nose. The pirates disembark, circling him like wolves. One raises a rope. "You're coming with us, friend," he says. Still, the man says nothing. He just smiles gently, as if he knows something they don't. And maybe he does. The pirates grab him, expecting a struggle. There isn't one. They bind his wrists and march him back to the boat. You think you see something shimmer in his pupils like reflected stars that don't belong to this sky. But you blink and it's gone. The rowboat returns to the ship. Ropes creak, sails groan, the tide sighs, and then nothing happens. For now. Now's a good time for a few facts while the pirates prepare their poor decision buffet. First, the island you're on might be Naxos, or maybe it's Tyrrhenia. Historians still argue about which beach hosted this particular cosmic prank. Ancient sources were famously casual with geography. Second wine god or not, Dionysus had quite the fashion sense. Purple robes were a big flex in ancient times. That color came from sea snails. Literally thousands of them crushed for a few ounces of dye. So yes, he was probably wearing snail goo couture. Divine and disgusting. The sky darkens. Back on the ship, the pirates gather, joking about their captive. He's too pretty to be trouble, one says. Another nudges him. Betty sings too. Probably some prince trying to escape his tutors. They laugh, but it's nervous laughter. The kind that doesn't know what it's laughing at. You stay hidden, for now. The air feels thicker. Wine sweet and humid like the sea is holding its breath. You know this night isn't going to end the way they think. But you also know it's too late for warnings. And let's be honest, you kind of want to see what happens next. The moment they hoist the stranger aboard, the wind dies. Not just slows dies. The sails sag, the waves hush. The sea, moments ago full of evening whispers, goes glassy and mute. One pirate jokes that the gods must be sleeping. Another spits over the side just in case it's a curse. You watch from the distant shore as the stranger, still calm, still smiling, is led to the center of the deck and tied once again more tightly this time. They've used their thickest rope, the kind meant for anchoring in storms, and yet as the last knot is pulled taut, it slithers loose like an insult. Not once, twice, then a third time. What in Hades? The captain barks, snatching the rope himself. They try again, and again. Each time the bindings refuse to hold. The rope twists, coils, and falls away, like it suddenly remembers it belongs to nature, not men. This would be a perfect moment to reevaluate life choices, but pirates, as a rule, are not known for introspection. The captain narrows his eyes at the stranger. What are you, still no answer? Just that infuriating smile. A little wider now. A little more knowing. It's the expression of someone who's 5 steps ahead and playing dumb for sport. One of the younger sailors crosses himself. He's a god, he whispers. An older pirate elbows him. He's a drunk noble playing dress up. Probably high on myrrh, which, by the way, was totally a thing. In ancient times, noblemen and poets, wandering around high on incense and fermented figs, mumbling about cosmic truths. Historians still argue whether the Greeks genuinely believed all their gods took mortal form, or if stories like these were metaphors that got wildly out of hand. But if you're on that boat right now, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you tried to kidnap a man whose smile makes the rigging twitch. Then something subtle changes. A trickle of wine drips from the mast. Just one bead at first, then 2, then an entire stream. It smells rich and thick like fermented grapes, sun-warmed and wild. One pirate, curious and frankly kind of dumb, licks his finger. His eyes widen. It's good he mutters like that somehow helps. The deck groans. The mast creaks again. Vines erupt, yes, literally twisting up the wood like green fire. Grape leaves unfurl. Clusters of glistening purple grapes appear from nowhere, heavy and ripe. The ship's timbers swell and warp under the weight. The pirates panic. They draw their swords, slashing at the vines, but each cut just brings more growth. The plants seem amused. They slither around ankles, curl into ropes, bloom fragrant flowers that make the air thick and dizzying. You sit on the beach stunned. This is no simple magic trick. This is divine theater. And Dionysus, he's the playwright, director, and star. With an audience of fools who just tied up a god. A few pirates stumble backward, reaching for their wine flasks in a daze. Mistake number 4. That wine tastes too good, too full. Their eyes gloss over, their legs wobble. One begins singing, off key. Here's a historical footnote for you. The ancient Greeks believed wine, when taken in excess, was a form of possession. Dionysus wasn't just the god of drinking, he was the god of letting go. Ecstasy, madness, transformation. So, drinking in his presence, that's not just rude. That's handing over the keys to your soul. And now the sea begins to swirl. A low mist creeps in so gradual you don't notice until it's hugging the hull. The moon vanishes behind clouds. Somewhere below deck you hear a sound. Not footsteps, not wind. Growling. Then it steps onto the deck. A lion. Real. Muscular. Its mane golden, its eyes luminous. Its snarls, lips, curling back to reveal ancient yellowed teeth. The vines part for it like courtiers before a king. One pirate screams. Another falls overboard. The captain draws a blade with shaking hands. "This is a dream," he mutters. "It's just bad wine." The lion roars. "It's not a dream." In the confusion, Dionysus rises. The ropes now lie in tatters at his feet as if they were never tied at all. He doesn't shout, doesn't move, just watches. Like a professor observing students fail a test they never studied for. One by one, the pirates leap into the sea. Some are screaming, some are silent. A few are laughing hysterically, as if they've gone mad and the madness feels good. And then comes the strangest part. They don't drown, they swim. Smoothly, too smoothly. Their limbs fuse. Their bodies arch and glide. Where there were panicked men flailing in the water now. Dolphins. Sleek. Intelligent. Eyeballing the ship with confusion or memory. You blink. Once. Twice. They're really dolphins. And Dionysus, he's gone, vanished. No footsteps, no trace. Only the vines remain wilting into nothingness as the wind finally stirs again, rustling the sails like a sigh of relief. You stare at the water where the dolphins circle, playful, curious, but somehow still. The next morning arrives softly, like a silk curtain falling across the waves. The sea looks peaceful again. The ship still, bobbing gently offshore, as if last night's spectacle was nothing but a figment of your overactive imagination. Except for the dolphins, they're still there, swimming around the hull, leaping now and then not in showy arcs, but with an eerie attentiveness, like sentries who remember being men. You sit on a dune, blinking at the sunlight, half expecting it to burn away the memory. But it doesn't. In fact, the more you stare, the more vivid it becomes. The wine, the vines, the lion, and that unshakable smile. You've just witnessed the story of Dionysus and the pirate dolphins, one of the oldest, strangest, and most wonderfully petty divine revenge tales in the Greek canon. The transformation isn't just a punishment. It's a cosmic joke. A lesson wrapped in irony, like putting a philosopher in a dunk tank. And here's the thing, that kind of transformation was Dionysus's specialty. You weren't just changed when he showed up, you were rewritten. The tale varies depending on the source. Some say the pirates were from Tyrrhenia, others say they were Cretan. Historians still argue whether the original myth was born out of a real cultural exchange between the Mycenaean Greeks and early seafarers, or if it evolved purely as an allegory for how humans underestimate beauty, mystery, and divinity. In simpler terms, don't judge a god by his glittery cloak. Now let's talk about ropes, yes, ropes. Ancient Greeks didn't just see knots as practical, they were magical. A rope that wouldn't bind meant more than bad craftsmanship. It meant divine refusal. And in this story, the repeated failure of the pirates' ropes was the first warning ignored, of course, as most warnings are when hubris is on board. The metamorphosis into dolphins. Symbolically delicious. Dolphins were considered liminal creatures swimming between worlds, often associated with music, prophecy, and even the afterlife. But also they were clever, playful, and in this myth cursed to remember. Not as penance, but as a reminder to everyone else some gods don't need to shout. They just swim around you forever, making you wonder what you almost understood. Meanwhile, Dionysus had vanished. Again, he does that. See, unlike Zeus, who thunders and struts around with lightning bolts, or Ares, who charges in with swords and red capes, Dionysus moves sideways, like smoke, like perfume, like a dream you half remember and can't quite explain. He is, how should we put this gently, the least consistent god on Mount Olympus. And that's exactly what makes him so dangerous and so beloved, because he's not a god of stability. He's a god of transformation. Now, most people know Dionysus as the god of wine. And yes, wine is his calling card. But what makes him so fascinating isn't the wine itself. It's what it does. How it lowers inhibitions. How it exposes truths. How it flips the world upside down just long enough to show you what you were too afraid to see when sober. That's why he didn't just appear in temples. He appeared at night at festivals in backwoods, rituals surrounded by the kinds of people the other gods ignored. Women, foreigners, outcasts, the poor. He didn't demand prayers, he invited you to dance, to sing, to release, to let go of the you the world expects and become the you that howls beneath. Here's your quirky tidbit of the evening. In some versions of the myth, after the pirates become dolphins, they continue to follow ships at sea, not to attack, but to warn, to guide. They've become spiritual lifeguards, with backstories no one would believe. Oh, this dolphin helped us steer around a storm. Sure it did. Maybe it also used to wear pants. Modern scholars debate whether this tale was originally meant to celebrate Dionysus's divinity or to scare people into respecting hospitality. Because in ancient Greece, xenia, the sacred law of treating strangers kindly, was a really big deal. Disrespecting a guest or mistaking a god for a beggar was like asking the universe to throw a lightning bolt at your kneecaps. And the pirates, they failed xenia on every level. They saw a beautiful stranger and thought, prophet. Dionysus saw their greed and thought, cetacean metamorphosis. Classic miscommunication. But the larger question lingers like salt on your skin. What kind of god does this? Not just a trickster? Not just a punisher? A mirror? Dionysus doesn't just reveal who you are, he reflects it back in a form you can't ignore. He turns pirates into dolphins, not to destroy them, but to say, this is what you are now. Playful, restless, beautiful, but never quite human again. As the sun climbs higher and the waves glitter with innocence, you realize something last night wasn't a storm. It was a revelation. You weren't just watching a myth, you were watching how myths work. They don't make sense. They make meaning. You sit with your toes buried in the sand, still watching the dolphins swirl. Their graceful, now smooth as marble statues, come to life. But you can't help wondering what lingers beneath that playful surface. Do they remember rope burns, the creak of planks? Under booted feet, the moment they first tasted fear? Or has the sea erased all that rinsing away their pasts with every leap and splash? You won't get an answer. Dionysus doesn't offer closure. He offers change. That's how he operates. And now maybe it's time to understand him better. Who was this glitter-draped mystery man, really? You trace his story back, not to Olympus, where the other gods lounge with golden goblets and petty grudges, but to something messier, more mortal. Dionysus wasn't born divine in the usual sense. His origin reads like a scroll, written during a thunderstorm by a drunk playwright. It begins with Semele, a mortal woman of Thebes, who caught the eye of Zeus. Yes, that Zeus, king of the gods, serial womanizer, part-time swan impersonator. He fell for Semele hard, so hard in fact that he made her pregnant. Naturally, Hera, Zeus's long-suffering, extremely vengeful wife, was not thrilled. Disguising herself as an old woman, Hera visited Semele and planted a dangerous idea in her head. If Zeus really loves you, she whispered, ask him to reveal himself in his full godly glory. Which, as any seasoned reader of Greek myth knows, is a terrible idea. Still, Semele asked. And Zeus, bound by an unbreakable divine promise, agreed. So one afternoon he revealed himself in his true form, blinding light, thunder, celestial power. And Semele, poor pregnant Semele, was incinerated on the spot. But Zeus, in a rare moment of tenderness, or maybe just panic, snatched the unborn baby from the ashes. He stitched the tiny form into his own thigh, hiding it there until it was ready to be born again. And that's how Dionysus became the only god in Greek mythology to be born twice. Once of a mortal woman, once of an immortal man. A fringe origin story for a fringe god. You imagine him now, that baby carried in thunder thighs, destined never to fit in. As he grew, Hera's wrath didn't stop. She sent madness persecution threats. So Zeus whisked Dionysus away. In some versions, he's raised by mountain nymphs. In others, by old man Silenus, a drunken sage with more wine than wisdom. Either way, the child learned early how to survive as an outsider. That explains a lot. Dionysus never became a temple god like Apollo or Athena. He didn't lecture about reason or war strategy. He traveled. Always traveling. Through Phrygia, Lydia, India, yes, India, at least according to some heroic exaggerations, his followers trailed behind him like a traveling circus satyrs with goat legs and flutes, maenads with wild eyes and ivy crowns. And let's talk about those maenads. They were women sometimes, wives, mothers, noble ladies who dropped everything to follow Dionysus into the woods. Once there, they danced, sang, drank, and occasionally tore animals to pieces with their bare hands. Nature documentaries rarely cover this part, but the Greeks weren't surprised. They believed that ecstasy, the Greek ecstasis, or to stand outside oneself, could lead to both joy and violence. Under Dionysus, people didn't become someone else. They became fully themselves, which, depending on the person, could be beautiful or terrifying. Your quirky tidbit for this stretch of the story. In some backwoods rituals, maenads were believed to suckle wolf cubs and nurse fawns. That's right. Gentle animal care and chaos, all in the same breath. Scholars still argue whether these tales were symbolic, exaggerated, or literal accounts of shamanic trance behaviors. Either way, you wouldn't want to bump into a maenad at a forest rave. So how does all this tie back to dolphins? Because Dionysus doesn't separate wonder from terror. His miracles are never purely sweet. They're double-edged gifts that shimmer with danger, just like the sea. The pirates didn't just kidnap a man. They tried to control something fundamentally uncontrollable. They saw softness and assumed weakness. They mistook serenity for simplicity. And in return, they were made into creatures who could never return to land, never forget what they'd done, but never speak of it either. That's not cruelty. That's a kind of poetry. Even the dolphins must admit, it fits. Back on shore, the sand warms under your fingers. A breeze rolls in, tasting faintly of grapes and salt. You can almost hear flutes in the distance, laughter just out of reach like a parade that passed through while you blinked. Maybe Dionysus is gone. Maybe he never left. The beach is quiet again, save for the gentle hiss of waves drawing lazy lines through the sand. The dolphins, your unexpected actors from the night before, have drifted out to sea, but you feel their presence linger like a song you can't quite forget. It's hard to tell whether you witnessed a myth or just dreamed with your eyes open, but that's how it always is with Dionysus. He doesn't knock. He dissolves the door entirely. You stretch your legs and wander inland through dry grasses that scratch against your calves. The trees here grow in odd shapes, bent, reaching, twisted like dancers frozen mid-spin. Everything seems to ripple with potential, as if it's not just a landscape but a stage, waiting for a god who might show up again when you least expect it. Now's a good time to remember that Dionysus wasn't just chaos in a bottle. He was a deeply disruptive force in Greek culture, and that's saying something considering the Greeks already had gods for war, theft, earthquakes, and general unpleasantness. Dionysus was different. He didn't just destroy cities, he destroyed certainty. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the city of Thebes. Cue King Pentheus. Now, Pentheus was a classic Greek ruler, stern jaw, strict laws, probably had his hair carved on coins. When he heard that a new foreign god was sweeping through the countryside, driving women mad and turning orderly villages into open-air wine festivals, he was not amused. Pentheus banned Dionysus worship, arrested followers, mocked the rituals, and when Dionysus, himself disguised, of course, in his usual dramatic flair, arrived in Thebes, Pentheus had him chained and thrown into prison. Spoiler alert, the prison collapsed on its own. Still, Pentheus wasn't convinced. So Dionysus played a different card. He convinced the king, this no-nonsense, dignity-obsessed king, to dress as a woman and sneak into the woods to spy on the maenads who were supposedly up to scandalous rituals. And Pentheus agreed. Historians still debate how this moment should be interpreted. Was it hubris madness? A divine enchantment? Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was something deeper. A revelation of Pentheus's secret desires, his fear, his repression. In Greek tragedy, the line between being tricked and being revealed is often blurry. Either way, Pentheus put on a wig grabbed a staff and tiptoed off to spy. It didn't end well. The Maenads in their frenzy saw him as a wild beast and intruder. They tore him apart, limb from limb, and leading them, his own mother Agave, who didn't recognize him until she held his severed head aloft in triumph. Greek myths do not believe in soft endings. You sit under a gnarled olive tree now staring up at the sky that once held gods and still holds questions. Pentheus wasn't just punished. He was unmasked. He tried to suppress something wild and in doing so became part of it. Dionysus didn't just want worship. He wanted acknowledgement. Not of himself, but of the wildness inside everyone. Your historical fact for this leg of the journey. The story of Pentheus is told in Euripides' The Bacchae, one of the most unsettling and powerful plays of classical Greece. Performed in Athens around 405 BCE, it was a warning against the dangers of denying the irrational parts of human nature. And now your quirky tidbit ancient Greeks sometimes believed that bees were born from the corpses of sacrificed bulls. Not relevant to Dionysus directly, but very on-brand for myths that blur the line between decay and rebirth. It's the same cycle he thrives in: rot, ferment, bloom. You look back toward the water. The dolphins are gone now. The waves lap like breathing. You wonder, did Pentheus deserve it? Did the pirates? Or were they just symbols? The truth is, Dionysus doesn't deal in fairness. He deals in transformation. He doesn't ask, is this just? He asks, is this real? Which might be why he keeps showing up in places he doesn't belong. A god with no fixed domain, no throne room, no courtroom, just wine wildness and the space between civilization and wilderness. He doesn't want to rule your city. He wants to break it open like a pomegranate. He wants to see what's inside. You leave the twisted olive trees behind, stepping back onto the sand with the sun now overhead, warm and heavy. There's no sign of dolphins anymore, just the gentle slap of waves and the rustle of coastal grasses. But something lingers in the air. Not a smell, not a sound, just a feeling. Like the world's edges are a little blurrier than before, which for Dionysus is exactly the point. See, the thing people often miss about him is that he isn't just a god of parties. He's a god of thresholds, of edges, of what happens when you leave yourself, just for a moment, and step into something you don't fully understand. And it's not all wine and ivy crowns. Dionysus is as much about terror as he is about joy. And that duality is baked into the very rituals used to honor him. Let's talk about the Dionysia. These were public festivals, yes, very public, where the city came together to honor Dionysus with drama processions and, yes, lots and lots of wine. The most famous was held in Athens, where playwrights like Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus presented tragedies that didn't just entertain, they unraveled you. Because that was the point. Theater, in its Greek origins, wasn't about popcorn and comfy seats. It was about confronting the limits of reason, feeling things you didn't expect, maybe even losing yourself for a few hours. The actor on stage wore a mask, but the audience, they took theirs off, and Dionysus presided over it all. Your historical fact of the moment, the city Dionysia in Athens, was one of the largest civic events of the year, involving thousands of citizens and drawing international attention. It combined religious ritual with theatrical innovation, and is considered a cornerstone of Western drama. But beyond the big festivals were the private rites, the secret ones. We're talking about the Dionysian mysteries, those elusive, highly ritualized experiences where initiates went into the wilderness, drank, danced, sometimes fasted, sometimes feasted, and came back changed. What happened during these rites? No one really knows. They were quite literally mysterious. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some initiates were blindfolded, spun in circles, and led into underground caves to simulate death and rebirth. Others may have worn masks made of vine leaves, goat hair, or even human ash. It was performance, yes, but also psychology. Long before Freud, there was Dionysus peeling people back to their core selves with music and moonlight. Scholars still argue whether these rites were liberating or manipulative. Were people empowered by them, or simply swept away in hysteria? The answer, as always with Dionysus, is both. You wander now through the edge of a crumbling ruin. Maybe it was once a temple, maybe just a house built near a sacred grove. Vines curl around the fallen stones. One particular chunk of marble still bears a faint engraving, a thyrsus, Dionysus's staff, topped with a pine cone and wrapped in ivy. The thyrsus was never a weapon in the usual sense, but like everything else in Dionysus's world, it looked soft and was secretly sharp, a symbol of joy that could still draw blood. That's how his whole mythology works. Opposites. Softness and steel. That's also why he appealed to those on the margins. Dionysus didn't show up for kings or generals. He showed up for the broken-hearted, the rejected, the ones who danced too wildly or laughed too loudly, women who weren't quiet enough, men who weren't strong enough, people who didn't quite fit the mold. And rather than fix them, he said, "You're exactly what the world needs. Let's make the mold bigger." It's no surprise then that Dionysus was one of the few gods worshipped outside of the typical priesthood structure. His followers were often self-organized, often ecstatic, often chaotic. But that chaos had structure. It had meaning. The wildness wasn't aimless. It was restorative. Think about it. The pirates who mocked a god were made into creatures still capable of joy. Pentheus, who tried to deny the irrational, became the ultimate victim of his own fear. But the women who danced in the mountains, the outcasts who sang under stars, they weren't punished. They were seen. And Dionysus didn't just see them, he danced with them. As you leave the ruin, something catches your eye. A scrap of old cloth tangled in a thorn bush. Deep purple. Faded now, but unmistakable. You don't touch it. You just nod as if to say, "Yes, I see you too." You keep walking deeper into the hills now, where the olive trees give way to pine and the light takes on that golden, syrupy glow that only happens just before sunset. The wind shifts. You catch the scent of crushed herbs, thyme, fennel, something musky and sweet that you can't quite name. It feels like you've crossed into another space. Not quite the past, not quite the present, somewhere in between. That's where Dionysus lives. He's not a god of the sky like Zeus, not a god of logic like Apollo. He lives in the between sanity and madness, between flesh and spirit. between ritual and riot. And the creatures who followed him, they understood that. You hear laughter distant and slow like echoes from another time. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's memory. Either way, your thoughts drift toward those strange women of Dionysus, the Maenads. Now you've heard a little about them already, how they danced in the woods, wore ivy in their hair, and sometimes tore wild animals, limb from limb. But the real story is more complicated and more human. These women weren't monsters. They were tired, repressed, controlled. In many Greek city-states, women couldn't vote, couldn't own land, and were often married off before they had a chance to grow into their own names. But once a year, when the festivals came, they left it all behind. They left the kitchens, the looms, the judging stairs. They took to the mountains barefoot and singing, led by the pull of something that felt older than rules. In Dionysus's rites, they weren't wives or mothers or daughters. They were just selves, feral-free, briefly divine. That's not fantasy. That's rebellion dressed in ecstasy. Your historical fact. The Maenads were not just mythological figures. There are documented accounts from Greek historians like Herodotus and Plutarch of real women participating in Bacchic rites, particularly in regions like Thrace and Boeotia. Some cities even banned the festivals for fear of social upheaval. Imagine fearing a party so much you made it illegal, and for good reason. These weren't just parties. They were undoings. In one version of Dionysus's myth, he sends his Maenads into foreign lands, not with weapons, but with flutes and wine. And cities fell, not to violence, but to frenzy. People danced themselves hoarse. They laughed themselves into visions. They let go of the very things that held their lives together. Was that madness? Or was it liberation? Historians still argue whether Dionysian worship was a healthy emotional release or a tool of crowd control, letting people scream once a year so they'd stay quiet the rest of the time. Either way, the scream was real. And in those screams, Dionysus whispered, "I see you." Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Maenads were believed to carry snakes, real ones, as part of their rituals. The snakes weren't just props. They were symbols of renewal of skin, shedding of constant transformation. Plus, you have to admit it takes a special kind of confidence to accessorize with a live serpent. You pause by a stream now, the kind that talks to itself in murmurs and splashes. You crouch down, trail your fingers through the water, and wonder what it would have been like to be one of them. To feel the mask of polite society fall away. To dance without knowing why. To stop apologizing for being too much. Because that's what Dionysus offered. Not just escape, but permission. You didn't have to be polite or perfect or composed. You could weep, shout, collapse into the arms of strangers and be caught, not judged. You could howl at the moon and call it worship. And through it all, Dionysus would be there. Not on a throne, not handing down commandments, just watching, smiling, occasionally turning your enemies into aquatic mammals, sure, but mostly reminding you that divinity isn't always clean. Sometimes it's ecstatic, raw, imperfect, just like you. The sun finally kisses the horizon and the forest turns bronze. Somewhere in the distance you think you hear the soft trill of a flute. It could be wind in a hollow branch, or it could be something else. You don't need to decide, not tonight. As twilight deepens, the trees around you stretch taller, darker, and more ancient. Their silhouettes blend into each other like old thoughts, some half-forgotten, others lingering just below the surface. You step carefully now, not out of fear, but respect, because the forest is no longer just a setting. It's a presence, and it's watching you back. This is the part of the journey where Dionysus stops being a charming wine-splashed wanderer and becomes something older, stranger. He's no longer just a party god or a champion of freedom. He's something you don't have a word for. He is the wildness inside the structure. Let's talk masks. In Greek theater, actors wore elaborate masks, some tragic, some comic, all meant to embody different roles. But in Dionysian ritual, the mask wasn't just for pretending, it was for revealing. The paradox was simple. When you covered your face, your true self came out. That's what Dionysus does. He makes you wear a mask until you realize you're not hiding, you're transforming. And this isn't just poetic language. Your historical fact for tonight, the word person comes from the Latin persona, which originally meant a theatrical mask. In Dionysian rites, participants were said to become their masks, merging identity with performance in ways that blurred the line between human and divine. So when you put on that ivy crown, or that deerskin robe, or that knowing grin in the dark, you weren't pretending. You were becoming. Now here's something that'll keep your brain gently buzzing. Dionysus wasn't always depicted the way we imagine him now. Young, pretty, soft. Early depictions show him as older, bearded, almost solemn. Only later, particularly during the Hellenistic period, did artists begin painting him as eternally youthful and androgynous. Historians still argue why. Was it a shift in religious philosophy? A response to Rome's obsession with youth? Or maybe it's because Dionysus, like his myths, refuses to stay still. He morphs with each generation, each culture, each believer. One century he's a god of vineyards. Another, he's a symbol of resistance. Another still, a queer icon of gender fluidity. And speaking of that, Dionysus blurred more than just social roles. He blurred all boundaries, including those of gender. He wore women's clothing. He danced with both men and women. He was soft, then violent, then nurturing, then cruel. In him, masculinity and femininity weren't opposites. They were threads of the same wine-dark tapestry. Your quirky tidbit in some versions of the myth Dionysus isn't raised by nymphs at all, but by two male lovers of Zeus. In others, he disguises himself as a woman to escape Hera's wrath. In nearly every form, he defies binary logic. And that defiance wasn't weakness, it was divine. Which makes sense when you think about what he represents. Duality, madness and insight, suffering and ecstasy, death and rebirth. You hear rustling behind you, not threatening, just a reminder that you're not alone. You turn slowly. It's a deer, small, quiet, watching you with those perfectly round eyes that hold more forest than fear. You don't move, neither does it. And for a moment you both exist in a pause, a breath between worlds. Then it vanishes, like a good metaphor. You smile. Dionysus would have loved that, because nothing in his world stays fixed. Everything is in flux. Even the pirates who became dolphins didn't simply disappear. They became something new, something fluid, something alive in a way they weren't before. And isn't that the point? This god of masks and madness doesn't offer salvation. He offers experience. He doesn't promise comfort. He promises truth. Not the kind you write in stone, the kind you dance barefoot into. As you walk again, the air thickens with twilight. The path narrows. You notice how your own footsteps sound different now, softer. Like even the earth wants to listen. And maybe you're starting to understand something. Dionysus was never trying to pull people into chaos just for the sake of it. He was pulling them out of numbness, out of walls, out of lives lived too neatly. He didn't want to destroy the world, just the cages inside it. That's why his punishments feel poetic, why his miracles come with teeth. He doesn't separate joy from fear. He hands you both and says, go on, drink, and you do. Because even now in a world of calendars and fluorescent lights and logins, something inside you still remembers how to dance until the line between yourself and the stars blurs. Something inside you still listens for flutes in the dark. Night has finally fallen, blanketing the forest in a velvet hush. The stars begin to poke through the darkness one by one, like small silver eyes. You sit down on a cool stone, exhaling deeply. The air tastes like pine and a little smoke, though there's no fire in sight. It's the kind of evening that feels older than time, where even your heartbeat seems to slow down in deference to whatever's watching from the trees. You're not scared, you're just quiet, which, if you've been paying attention, is exactly where Dionysus wants you. Not screaming, not laughing, just aware. And now that we've seen his wilder mythic side, Dolphins' madness masks all of it. It's time to explore something a little subtler, but just as central, the contradiction of Dionysus. Because if you asked 100 ancient Greeks who he really was, you'd get 100 different answers. To some, he was liberator, freeing mortals from sorrow and pain through joy and intoxication. To others, he was a trickster, a threat to order, someone who pulled at the seams of society until they frayed. To his followers, he was a gentle god. But to his enemies, he was utterly terrifying. It's hard to put your finger on a god like that. And that's exactly the point. Your historical fact for this section, Dionysus, is one of the only Greek gods who was once mortal. Some scholars argue this is why his worship felt so personal. He knew suffering, madness, rejection. He'd lived it. He didn't just sit on Olympus. He wandered, he wept, he fled. And when he came back, he demanded to be seen, which is a kind of power that doesn't need thunder or tridents. It just needs presence. Now let's take a detour into philosophy, quietly, of course. Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher with the most dramatic mustache in history, built his entire theory of art and tragedy on the contrast between two gods, Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo, the god of order, reason, clarity. Dionysus, the god of chaos, feeling, instinct. Nietzsche believed that all great art and all great life requires both. You need the structure, yes. But without wildness, without the raw pulse of emotion, it's all statue, no heartbeat. So when Dionysus shows up in a myth, it's not to ruin things, it's to complete them. Your quirky tidbit there was a cult of Dionysus. in Thrace, where worshippers believed that the god died and was reborn every year, torn apart by titans and resurrected in spring. This version of the myth closely resembles older vegetation gods from even earlier cultures. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was a purely Greek invention or a much older deity smuggled in through wine and song. Either way, he doesn't fit neatly into a box, which frankly is why he still fascinates people today. You shift slightly on your stone seat, listening to the breeze pass through the leaves above you. Somewhere in the distance, a single owl hoots. Maybe it's coincidence, maybe it's commentary. With Dionysus, either explanation is valid, and what about those dolphins? Let's not forget them. Even after all this rituals masks madness, they remain part of his story. The ones who tried to bind him, silence him, sell him, ended up as reminders. Not corpses, not ashes, but intelligent, watchful swimmers. Why dolphins? Because they're beautiful, mysterious, capable of joy and mischief. Because they live in a world just adjacent to ours, close enough to see us, far enough that we can't follow. That's what Dionysus does. He doesn't erase you, he changes your context. Maybe the pirates didn't deserve death, maybe they just needed perspective, and now they have it. You lie back on the stone, staring up at stars that don't blink. Your mind floats, your breath slows, and you think maybe this God isn't just about wine or rebellion or dance. Maybe he's about surrender, letting go of the illusion of control, letting yourself be seen, letting yourself become. The stars overhead have multiplied, glittering so densely now that the sky looks like a shattered mirror, each piece holding a version of the world slightly different from your own. The Milky Way spills across it in a soft arc like a wine stain left by some divine reveler. You lie still, arms folded behind your head, letting the night press gently down on your chest, not as a weight, but as a presence. And as you stare up, it occurs to you Dionysus is still here, not in form, not even in memory, but in ambience. He's in the way your thoughts refuse to stay linear, in the flicker of images, half dreams, feelings that rise without prompting. Dionysus doesn't knock. He just opens a window inside you and lets in the breeze. Let's drift now slowly into how Dionysus shaped culture. Not just myth, not just ritual, but the very fabric of how people expressed themselves. We've touched on the theater festivals, the Grand Dionysia in Athens, but there's more, so much more, because Dionysus wasn't content with the stage. He slipped into everything: art, music, literature, perfume, fashion, even philosophy. Take, for instance, the simple act of wearing perfume. You might think that has nothing to do with a god of wine and wildness, but in ancient Greece, scent was sacred. It was believed to carry divine essence, to thin the veil between mortal and divine. And Dionysus, he was the most perfumed of all gods. Frankincense myrrh, exotic oils imported from Egypt and the Near East, all of them associated with his rituals. Historical fact: ancient Greek playwrights often reference Dionysus's scented presence. His followers weren't just drunk, they were fragrant. The combination of wine flowers and spice created an atmosphere where every sense was heightened. The divine wasn't just seen or heard, it was smelled. Quirky tidbit: Some Dionysian rituals required initiates to bathe in scented water before participating, not for cleanliness, but to loosen the body, open the pores, and ready the soul for transformation. The scent itself became a gateway. You sit up now slowly, and imagine the air around you is thick with that same perfume. Not cloying, just enough to tilt your mind towards something looser, softer, like a song you don't know the words to but still hum along with. Let's talk about his look too. Dionysus didn't do armor, no bronze breastplates or shining helmets. He wore robes, sometimes sheer, often flowing, crowns of ivy, jewelry, feminine by Greek standards, bold by anyone's. And that wasn't weakness, it was power. Because Dionysus taught the Greeks and later the Romans that identity could be a costume, that you could slip into another self and still be whole. That fluidity wasn't loss, it was growth. You've probably noticed by now Dionysus wasn't just queer-friendly by modern terms. He was queerness long before the term existed. He made ambiguity divine. He danced across categories man and woman human and God sane and mad, and the world followed. Even the Romans couldn't resist. They called him Bacchus, and they adored him with an almost dangerous enthusiasm, which is saying something considering this was a culture known for gladiators and plumbing. But the Roman version of Dionysus got louder. The festivals became more decadent, the drinking more excessive. Eventually the Senate panicked. Around 186 BCE, the Bacchanalia was suppressed by official decree. The fear that secret meetings and ecstatic rituals were threatening the state's order. You know, the usual people having too much fun must be treason logic. Historians still argue whether the crackdown was political or religious, but one thing's clear: Dionysus was never a tame god. Even when adopted by a hyper-disciplined empire, he slipped through the cracks, like wine spilled on marble, staining it just enough to leave a mark forever. You exhale now, long and slow. The forest around you has gone full stillness. No breeze, no animals, just silence, but not emptiness. It's the kind of silence that waits, that listens back, and you realize something else Dionysus never asks you to believe. He asks you to feel. He doesn't require logic or perfection or devotion, just willingness, a loosening, a crack in the armor, a night under the stars where you let go of the story you tell the world and maybe whisper a truer one beneath it. That's why his myths endure. Not because they're tidy, but because they aren't. They're like dreams you wake up from with sand still in your hair. Like laughter that turns into tears for no reason at all. Like the sudden urge to dance in the kitchen at midnight with no music playing. Dionysus lives in those moments, always has, always will. The night has ripened now. No more twilight softness, just the deep, velvety dark of true midnight. The forest hums with a kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty but charged. Like the silence right before a note is struck. You stay where you are, sensing that movement would break whatever fragile spell has descended over the land. And maybe that's the point. Stillness can be holy too. Let's talk now about where Dionysus felt safe. Because for all his wandering, for all his shape-shifting, there was one island he returned to again and again. A quiet place amid the Aegean where myth met healing. Naxos. It's where the dolphins swam after their transformation, where the vines seemed to grow thicker, where the wine flowed without measure or consequence. But more than that, it's where he found her, Ariadne. You might remember her as the princess of Crete, the one who helped Theseus slay the Minotaur by handing him a ball of thread. Smart, brave, and surprise abandoned. After Theseus escaped the labyrinth, he took Ariadne with him, promised her everything, and then left her alone on the shore of Naxos like forgotten luggage. Not exactly a love story for the ages. But Dionysus, he found her. Depending on which version you prefer, he either stumbled upon her sleeping or arrived just as she woke in tears. Either way, he didn't pass her by. He married her, not just symbolically. Divinely, he made her immortal, gave her a crown of stars, literally a constellation known as the Corona Borealis. If you look up on a clear night, you can still see it curled gently in the heavens. Your historical fact, the myth of Ariadne, was wildly popular in ancient Greece and Rome, especially among women. It symbolized rescue rebirth and the idea that even those discarded by heroes could become divine. In art, she's often depicted asleep on the shore, half lit by moonlight, with Dionysus approaching in the background, like a fever dream in silk. And here's a deliciously quirky tidbit. Some versions say Dionysus didn't just marry Ariadne, he gave her her own sacred vineyard, where the grapes never stopped ripening. Eternal harvest. Eternal intoxication. That's a honeymoon package the gods can get behind. But back to Naxos. Why did Dionysus feel so at home here? Because it wasn't about temples or altars. It was about abandonment. About what you find when everything else leaves you. Dionysus, after all, was abandoned too. Born to a mortal mother, orphaned by lightning, raised in secret, always on the run. He understood Ariadne's grief because he'd lived it. That moment of waking up alone and wondering if the world even noticed you existed. On Naxos, they didn't just fall in love. They recognized each other. And recognition that's rarer than divinity. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine that shoreline, the waves slipping in like silk, the stars overhead, uncaring but generous, the two of them sitting side by side with their wounds showing, not hiding them, not apologizing for them, just being. That's the kind of love Dionysus offers, not perfect, not orderly, but deep, wild, full of shadow and moonlight. He doesn't ask you to be healed before you're worthy. He meets you in the wreckage and pours a drink. Because that's the thing people often misunderstand. Dionysus wasn't about destruction for destruction's sake. He was about clearing space, breaking down what no longer served you, so something real, something untamed could grow in its place. And Ariadne, she didn't get justice from Theseus. She didn't get closure. She got transcendence. Historians still debate whether Ariadne's myth was originally her own or whether it was absorbed into Dionysus's orbit later on. But once they met in the stories, they never let go of each other, not in art, not in ritual, not in the collective imagination. And maybe that's the truest thing about gods. They don't stay fixed. They evolve with us, through us. Even now, thousands of years later, Dionysus still walks the edge of every stage, every protest, every broken heart that decides to sing anyway. He's in the music that makes you cry, the scent that unlocks a memory, the dance you didn't plan. And yes, he's still on the beach, waiting for someone the world threw away. The forest behind you sleeps now fully. No rustles, no distant calls. Even the wind has curled up and tucked itself into the roots. You've wandered down toward the water again, drawn back to where the night first began, though it feels like centuries have passed since that quiet stranger stepped barefoot onto the shore. The moon sits high and round, reflected perfectly in the sea below, a silver twin watching itself. And just beyond the reach of the waves, you think you see something move. But it's not a dolphin this time, it's you. Not your body, but some version of yourself, flickering on the surface like a thought you've only just begun to have. One that's more honest, a little weirder, a little freer. And with that image still shimmering in your mind, we arrive at perhaps the most difficult thing to explain about Dionysus, why he meant so many things to so many people. Because gods, as a rule, tend to have specialties. Poseidon rules the sea. Demeter handles the harvest. Athena handles strategy and wisdom and giving people very stern looks. But Dionysus, he defies specialization. He's the god of wine, yes, but also madness, theater, fertility, transformation, liberation, paradox, rebirth, duality, loss, music, ecstasy, rage, joy, pain, and about a dozen other things scholars still fight over at conferences. Your historical fact: in the Hellenistic period, Dionysus became one of the most syncretized deities in the ancient world. That means he was constantly being fused with other gods: Osiris in Egypt, Sabazius in Phrygia, even Jesus in some fringe Greco-Roman mystery texts. Historians still argue whether this was cultural blending or theological panic. Either way, Dionysus refused to stay in one mythos. He moved, because that's what he does. You can't pin him down. You can only follow the footprints he leaves in wine-stained soil. Some scholars claim this flexibility is what made Dionysus so dangerous. He appealed to women and slaves, to the foreign and the queer, to the ones who weren't allowed to speak too loudly. And when they gathered under his name, laughing, singing, shedding identities like snakeskin, the old world trembled. Why? Because people who feel deeply are harder to control. And Dionysus made people feel without apology, without permission. You're a quirky tidbit. There are ancient depictions of Dionysus riding not just in chariots, but in bathtubs, pulled by panthers, or on boats with sails made of grape leaves. This wasn't just whimsy, it was visual theology. The idea that the divine doesn't need to be majestic. It can be absurd, playful, even ridiculous. Because in a world that prizes stoicism, what's more rebellious than joy? You crouch at the water's edge, now letting the foam cool your fingertips. A few stars reflect back at you, spinning slowly with the ripple. You wonder if the dolphins are near, if they know you're here, if they ever really left. And that's when it hits you. Dionysus is not a god of conclusions. He's a god of process, of becoming, of the moment between inhale and exhale, when the body forgets it's supposed to be a shape and just is. He's not about where you end up. He's about where you get lost and what you find when you stop trying to be found. Even the pirates, those foolish, greedy, luckless men, they didn't die. They weren't erased. They were rewritten, given another form, another rhythm, another way to move through the world. Is it punishment, mercy, both? That's the trick with Dionysus. He never gives you just one answer. He gives you every answer and asks you to dance with them until you stop trying to win. You lean back, staring at the night sky again. Somewhere a faint breeze returns. The trees sigh almost thoughtfully. Maybe tomorrow you'll forget all of this. Or maybe in some quiet moment, a taste, a song, a shadow you'll remember and you'll smile. And somewhere in the ocean, a dolphin will surface and watch you for just a moment longer than it needs to. You wake before dawn, or maybe you never slept at all. Either way, the sky has shifted again from inky black to that soft, bruised blue that only happens in the minutes before the sun decides to rise. You're still by the water, arms folded over your knees, eyes stinging slightly from salt, and something more tender, the kind of ache that doesn't come from the body. It's a strange place to feel at peace. And yet you do. Because something in you understands. Now this story, this God, this myth, it wasn't meant to be tidy. It was meant to rattle you. To tap on the glass of your well-ordered thoughts until you looked up and realized the structure was always just scaffolding, that the real self, the one beneath the masks and roles, might be made of different stuff entirely. And Dionysus, he saw that from the beginning. So let's return just for a moment to those dolphins. For centuries, the Greeks believed dolphins were sacred, not just smart or useful, but blessed. Sailors who fell overboard prayed to them. Artists carved them into temples. Children were told that if you treated the sea with respect, dolphins would come to help you when you needed it most. But behind that grace, behind the smooth skin and playful eyes, was a whisper of something else. A memory, a warning. These creatures weren't always dolphins. They were men. And not just any men, and men who ignored the signs, who laughed at magic, who saw beauty and thought profit. And yet, they were spared. Not spared in the way mortals usually hope. There was no going back to their ships, no return to port. But they were given continuance, a second chance in a different shape, one that matched the spirit they denied in life. That's mercy with a sharp edge. Your historical fact. Dolphins appear in over 24 distinct myths across the ancient Mediterranean. In some they save poets, in others they carry the souls of the dead. But in every version they're intermediaries between sea and sky, death and life, man and God. And your quirky tidbit, the Greek word for dolphin, delphin, shares a root with Delphi, the site of Apollo's most famous oracle. And who did Apollo inherit Delphi from? That's right, Dionysus. For part of the year, the god of wine ruled the oracle. The god of madness sat in the seat of prophecy. Historians still debate whether this was a symbolic balance between light and dark, or a relic from an even older mythological system. But the implication is clear. Even the gods of clarity must make room for chaos. And perhaps, just perhaps, madness contains its own kind of wisdom. You stand now brushing sand from your clothes, watching the first hints of gold crest the horizon. It's quiet but not silent. Somewhere offshore, a fin slices through the surface and disappears again. You smile. There's one more detail about the myth that sticks with you. After the transformation, Dionysus doesn't gloat. He doesn't curse them, he simply moves on as if he always knew how the story would end. As if it wasn't about punishment at all, but about transformation through humility. And that is the most dangerous thing about him. He's not cruel, he's right. He doesn't destroy, he reveals. That's why his rituals had to be wild. Why his festivals had to be ecstatic. Because to know Dionysus is not to study him, it's to feel him, to fall under the same spell. The pirates did the same trance, the Maenads danced through the same mystery Ariadne woke into. It's to lose yourself, just long enough to come back different. As you walk back along the shore, each footstep light in the cool sand, you realize this is what the myth was trying to tell you all along. Not how to avoid transformation, but how to let it happen. The sun is peaking now, timid but rising. The horizon burns orange, a streak of fire stitched against the slow-turning sky. You're walking inland again, your feet tracing back over the same dunes, the same folds of sand, but everything feels different. Because you are different. That's what Dionysus does remember. He doesn't change the landscape. He changes you. And as you climb the same ridge where this whole strange journey began, you glance behind. No footprints. The tide has erased them all. Of course it has. That's his signature. So now that you've danced with the myths, sung with the Maenads, wept with Ariadne, and swum metaphorically, let's hope with dolphins, it's time to gather the loose threads. Who is Dionysus really? Let's answer that question the only way he'd approve of from many angles. To the average Athenian, Dionysus was the god who brought them the theater. Without him, no tragedies, no comedies, no catharsis. They'd gather in the amphitheater, thousands at a time, watching stories of kings, fools, and fate unravel under masks and moonlight, all to honor a god who believed in feeling over form. To the women who followed him into the mountains, he was a savior, a release valve, a holy escape from the roles they were never allowed to step outside. He gave them space to scream, to collapse, to rise again in sweat and song. To philosophers like Plato, he was problematic, too wild, too emotional, but even they couldn't ignore his power. You don't have to like chaos to know it's real. To Rome, he was Bacchus, celebrated in secret, feared in public. His rites were considered dangerous enough to outlaw, not because they harmed, but because they awakened. And there's nothing more threatening to power than people who suddenly feel too much. To you, he might just be a myth, but maybe not. Your historical fact. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate passed the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a decree that restricted the Bacchic cults throughout Italy. The document, carved in bronze, still survives. It's one of the oldest pieces of Roman legislation we possess. Why such fear? Because people were gathering at night without permission, and they weren't just drinking, they were transforming. And your quirky tidbit. Some of Dionysus's followers believed that if you whispered your deepest desire into a cup of wine during a full moon, he would hear it, but he wouldn't grant it. Oh no. He'd reveal whether you really wanted it at all. That's the kind of God he is. He doesn't give you what you ask for. He gives you what you mean. You crest the last hill and see the sea spread out behind you, wide and glowing. That same ship still bobs in the distance, the one that once carried pirates, now watched over by dolphins. Or maybe it's not the same ship. Maybe it never was. But the lesson remains. When you try to control what you don't understand, when you mock beauty, when you bind the unbindable, you become something else. Not out of punishment, out of alignment. You become the thing you were too afraid to see in yourself. The gods, especially Dionysus, don't always strike you down. Sometimes they just rewrite you, and you live on. You exist, changed, swimming in a different rhythm. And whether you call it madness or magic, it no longer matters, because deep down, something in you remembers the vines creeping up the mast, the lion's roar, the ropes that wouldn't stay tied, the way the world shimmered for a moment and how it never quite stopped shimmering after that. You sit down in the grass watching the last of the moon disappear into morning. You breathe, and Dionysus, maybe he's gone, or maybe he's already in your bloodstream. The morning comes gently now, soft and golden, pressing the dew from the blades of grass like a kiss. You're still perched on your hilltop knees, tucked to your chest, the horizon stretching endlessly before you. The ocean sparkles, no drama, no visions, just the calm lapping of light on water. And yet, something still flickers beneath it all. You're not haunted exactly, but touched, the way you are after hearing a song you don't understand but can't stop humming. That's how Dionysus works, not as a thunderclap, as a whisper that follows you home. You take one more look at the sea, then turn inland. Let's wander together now, not in the hills, but in the echoes. Because Dionysus didn't just shape myths, he left fingerprints all over the world in ways you wouldn't expect. Take art, for example. In ancient sculpture, Dionysus appears in hundreds of forms, bearded and strong, delicate and young eyes, half closed in dreamlike bliss, or wide open with something wilder behind them. One statue might show him lounging with a cup of wine, another mid-leap, his head tossed back in ecstasy. No two images are the same, and that's the point. Your historical fact. In the later classical and Hellenistic periods, Dionysus became a favorite subject of sculptors who wanted to push boundaries. The sleeping Dionysus motif, often carved into marble for garden sanctuaries, was one of the earliest examples of male nudes presented in a vulnerable, almost feminine pose. This challenged traditional Greek ideals of masculinity and opened new pathways in how the divine was imagined. And now, your quirky tidbit. In some depictions, Dionysus is shown riding a leopard or sometimes inexplicably a donkey covered in grapevines. Why? Because his entourage wasn't made of kings and warriors. It was satyrs, misfits, and beasts. The divine didn't travel in chariots. It stumbled barefoot across vineyards laughing. Now think of music. The aulos, the reedy double-piped flute, often played during his rites, was said to induce trance. Some ancients believed it wasn't the melody that mattered, but the rhythm, repetition. That's what made the soul leave the body, what made the boundaries blur. Modern scholars sometimes call Dionysian ritual early psychodrama, but the Greeks had no such term. They just knew if you danced long enough, you forgot who you were. And that forgetting, that was sacred. You reach a small grove now, where sunlight dapples through fig leaves. The air is still cool. You imagine the Maenads would have liked it here. Plenty of space to move. good acoustics for wailing hymns, maybe even a good tree to tie a mask onto when it slipped down your face. And this brings us to another side of Dionysus's legacy, his influence on the human soul's relationship to itself. In Jungian psychology, Dionysus is often invoked as the archetype of the shadow, that wild, creative, dangerous part of the psyche we're trained to suppress. But repress it long enough and it comes out anyway. Louder, stranger wearing ivy in its hair. Dionysus is what happens when you stop lying to yourself. He's the dream you don't want to talk about, the impulse you can't explain, the laugh that bursts out at the wrong time. He's the full truth, the unedited version. And that, of course, is what makes him so necessary. In a world obsessed with control, he is the great unbuttoning. He says, dance until you don't remember your job title. He says, cry if the moon looks too beautiful. He says, forgive yourself for not being simple. And you listen, not because you should, because you can't help it. You lean against a fig tree now watching a bee dip lazily from flower to flower. Everything is slow. No urgency, no destination, just being. And it hits you softly. Dionysus was never about escape. He was about return. Return to feeling, to body, to the animal hum beneath the intellect. He wasn't trying to destroy society. He just wanted it to remember its heartbeat. The heartbeat that gets drowned out in deadlines. The heartbeat that only reappears when you're dancing in your kitchen at 2:00 a.m. You close your eyes. And for a moment, you can still hear that flute. You open your eyes slowly, still leaning against the fig tree, your limbs loose, and your breath soft. There's no rush to stand, no expectation to move. The morning is kind, and for once you allow yourself to match its pace. A bird calls once, then twice, and then falls silent again, as if it too understands that some moments aren't meant to be filled with noise. Let's stay here a little longer, because there's one thing left that still needs unraveling. One lingering thread in this wine-soaked tapestry of God's mortals' masks and transformation. And it's this, why do none of Dionysus's stories make sense in a straight line? You've probably noticed by now his myths don't follow neat arcs. There's no clear hero's journey, no moral conclusion. He's born twice, he dies and comes back. He's a child in one story and a wild-eyed adult in the next. He's gentle, then terrifying, then gone. It's like trying to map a dream. And that's exactly what ancient sources struggled with. Your historical fact. Unlike other Olympians who had centralized temples and formal rites, Dionysus's worship was scattered. Local variations of his myths differed dramatically. In some towns he was a civilizing god, in others a dangerous outsider. Some regions portrayed him as a savior, others as a threat. Scholars still argue whether these contradictions point to a single origin myth or to 1,000 stories stitched together over time. So how do we make sense of him? Maybe we don't. Maybe sense was never the point. Dionysus wasn't meant to be understood. He was meant to be experienced. That's the difference. Apollo teaches, Dionysus possesses. One carves the statue, the other makes it dance. Even in literature, his influence remains slippery. Take Euripides' The Bacchae, arguably the definitive Dionysian text. It's a tragedy, yes, but it doesn't end with a tidy lesson. It ends with agony, with madness, with a mother realizing she's killed her own son under divine spell. And Dionysus, he doesn't apologize. He simply leaves satisfied that his divinity has been recognized. Brutal, yes, but also honest. Because some truths don't teach, they transform. That's your quirky tidbit. In ancient vase paintings, Dionysus is often surrounded not by kings or priests, but by satyrs, half human, half animal beings who represent pure instinct. Lust, hunger, laughter, they're clumsy, loud, and absurd. But they're also joyful. And Dionysus never judges them. He welcomes them, which tells you something about the kind of God he is. He doesn't love perfection. He loves presence. You step away from the tree now, barefoot in the grass. The sun is higher, and the sea behind you has begun to glitter again. You feel the itch of salt on your skin, the memory of vines on wood, the faint thrum of distant drums that no longer play. And you understand Dionysus isn't just a figure in history, he's a mirror. He reflects what you repress, what you long for, what you fear. That's why he turns pirates into dolphins, not to punish them, but to show them what they could not see in themselves. That's why he leads women into forests, to remind them of a voice they'd buried. That's why he tears down kings, to show them the cost of denying the sacred. And that's why he dances, because dancing is surrender without submission. It's control dissolved, but not lost. It's rhythm instead of rigidity. It's truth without needing to explain it. You pause on a hill crest just before descending again. The air is warm now, the kind that makes you close your eyes and stretch, just because it feels good. And that's when it really lands. All this time you weren't following a myth. You were following yourself. Dionysus didn't lead you here. He unleashed you here. Now there's no grand revelation, no blinding light, just a softness in the chest, a loosening of the spine, the gentle whispered realization that you've been wearing a mask for far too long. And it's okay to set it down now. Not because anyone's watching, but because you are. The path down the hill is slow and winding. Not steep, not difficult, just contemplative. The kind of walk where your feet seem to know the way, even if your mind doesn't. And for the first time, you're not trying to rush anywhere. You're not looking for the next clue, or twist, or answer. You're just walking. And with every step, something sheds. A worry, a role, a voice that isn't yours. You've been carrying so many layers you didn't know were heavy. This weightlessness is what Dionysus offers. But don't mistake it for recklessness. Because if there's one last thing to understand about this God, it's that he's not just about freedom. He's about integration. Let me explain. Dionysus doesn't ask you to run from yourself. He asks you to become whole, to take the wild and the wounded, the sacred and the shameful, and hold them all in the same breath. And the symbol of that wholeness, his followers called it enthusiasmos. That's where we get the word enthusiasm, by the way. But to the Greeks, it meant to be filled with a god. Specifically with Dionysus, it didn't mean excitement. It meant possession, not the horror movie kind. The beautiful kind. The kind where for just a moment the divine steps inside you not to replace you, but to amplify you, to show you who you really are when no one's watching. When you stop performing and start becoming. Your historical fact. In Plato's Phaedrus, the philosopher grudgingly admits that divine madness, including Dionysian ecstasy, can be a source of inspiration. That the poet, the lover, the prophet all tap into madness to find something truer than logic. Even the most orderly mind of ancient Greece had to make room for a little wine-soaked truth. And your quirky tidbit, ancient Greeks had a word for people who resisted Dionysus's call, amathoi, meaning the uninitiated. These were people who chose not to feel, not to loosen, not to cross the threshold. They were often portrayed in stories as blind stiff and ultimately tragic. It's not a moral failure. It's a missed invitation. You reach a meadow now, wide and open the grass, bowing slightly in the breeze, like it's welcoming you home. You lie down, arms outstretched, and stare up at the clouds, which drift slowly like boats, with nowhere urgent to be. And you think about the masks, all the ones you've worn, the smile when you were tired, the silence when you wanted to shout, the strength when you were breaking. Dionysus doesn't tear them off. He doesn't shame you for needing them. He just waits until you're ready to set them aside. And when you do, he's not above a little celebration. So picture this, you barefoot in the grass, surrounded by music you can't quite hear, but can feel in your ribs, grapevines curling through your fingers, laughter bubbling in your chest. Not from a joke, from the sheer relief of not pretending anymore. That's your initiation, not into a cult, not into a doctrine, into yourself. And somewhere, maybe in myth, maybe just in memory, Dionysus sees you, smiles, and moves on. Because he never stays in one place. He's already headed to the next hill, the next ruined palace, the next lost soul, pretending they don't want to be found. He'll get there. He always does. And you'll carry this, not as a burden, but as a hum in your blood, a song under your breath, a way of walking that's looser now, like you're no longer bracing for impact. You've survived the transformation. You weren't destroyed. You were reborn. You sit up slowly in the meadow, brushing a few blades of grass from your arms. The sky is wide now, no longer that tense, star-scattered canvas of midnight, but a calm, pale blue, brushed lightly with gold. It feels honest, like the kind of light that doesn't hide anything. And still there's a softness to it, a mercy. You've made it through the night. But before we let this journey fade completely, there's one last turn to take one final place where Dionysus quietly waded through centuries of silence, the mysteries. We've touched on the Dionysian mysteries already, the rituals, the masks, the dances in the woods, but there's more. Something deeper. Something that may explain why Dionysus survived even as gods around him faded into marble and myth. Because Dionysus didn't just offer wine or madness. He offered rebirth. And that changes everything. In many versions of the myth, especially those whispered in the shadowed corners of ancient temples, Dionysus was not just born twice. He died and was reborn. Not symbolically, literally. Torn apart by the Titans as a child, then resurrected by Zeus, the pieces of his body scattered and reassembled, his heart saved and remade into something divine. Sound familiar? That's because it is. Your historical fact the Orphic Mysteries, an ancient religious movement based on teachings attributed to the mythical poet Orpheus, centered Dionysus as a god who had suffered, died, and returned. To Orphic followers, Dionysus's death was the original wound of the universe, and his rebirth held the key to human salvation. These mysteries offered initiates secret knowledge, purification rituals, and the hope of a better afterlife. That's right. The god of chaos was also the god of resurrection. Now that's a twist. And here's your quirky tidbit. In Orphic burial rites, initiates were sometimes buried with a small golden tablet containing instructions for the afterlife. One such tablet reads, "I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone." It was meant to remind the soul, lost and disoriented in death, that it belonged to something divine. And who greeted them in that next world? Dionysus. Not Zeus, not Hades, Dionysus. Why? Because he understood suffering. He knew what it meant to be torn apart, to be abandoned, to be remade. And because of that, he didn't just guide the living through ecstasy, he guided the dead through darkness. You stand now quietly, letting that realization settle in your chest. The God who turned pirates into dolphins was the same God who wept, who wandered, who was betrayed, who somehow never stopped dancing. That's what makes him powerful. Not just his mystery, but his mercy. He doesn't promise you won't suffer. He promises it will mean something, that you'll come out the other side not untouched, but transformed. You begin to walk again slowly. The path is familiar now, not in shape, but in spirit. You've been here before in 100 different ways. After every heartbreak, every breakdown, every moment you thought you'd lost yourself and somehow found a version of you more real than the one you started with. That's Dionysus's gift. Not clarity, but integration. He takes your contradictions and turns them into constellations. He takes your brokenness and calls it holy, and maybe that's why he never really went away. Even when temples crumbled, even when his name was whispered instead of shouted, even when scholars tried to fold him into other gods, into new systems, into safer categories, he stayed. You feel him in poetry, in jazz, in protest, in perfume, in grief that becomes art, in joy that's loud and unplanned and completely unprofessional. He is the sacred mess, and now so are you. The path is narrowing now, leading you through a corridor of olive trees whose trunks twist like sleeping serpents, their leaves whispering above your head. The air is warm with early sun, and your footsteps sound softer, like the earth is cushioning them, honoring the fact that you've come this far. And there's only one place left to go, back to the beginning, to that quiet beach. You crest a final rise, and there it is, the same stretch of shore where this whole strange winding myth first unfurled. The sea lies still as polished glass, not a ripple out of place, but the weight of everything that's happened hangs in the air like low music. You feel it in your shoulders, in your chest, in the way you exhale, and it actually feels like release. There's no sign of dolphins this time, but you don't need them anymore, because now you understand the transformation wasn't theirs alone. It was yours too. So as we prepare to close this journey, let's look at one last paradox. Dionysus is often called the god of madness, and yet his myths are some of the most sane things you'll ever hear. Why? Because they admit what we all live with: contradiction. We are brave and scared, loud and silent, loving and resentful, dreamers and doubters. Dionysus doesn't ask us to choose. He says, be both, be many, be whole. Your historical fact. By the Roman imperial period, Dionysus had become one of the most beloved deities across the empire, worshipped not just by the outcasts, but by emperors, actors, soldiers, and mystics. His image was found in villas and tombs, painted on frescoes and carved into sarcophagi. Why? Because his message endured. Joy and suffering are not opposites. They are companions. And here's one last quirky tidbit. There's a lost Greek comedy known only from fragments, where Dionysus tries to sneak into the underworld wearing women's clothes and arguing with Heracles. It's ridiculous. It's brilliant. It reminds us even gods aren't above dressing up and making fools of themselves for a cause. Even gods know how to laugh. And now you've walked through every layer, from pirate ships to mountain rites, from masks to mysteries, from grapes to stars. And what has it all taught you? That transformation isn't a lightning bolt. It's a slow bloom. It's a whisper in the chest. It's a God who wears no crown, but makes you feel like you've stepped outside time. Dionysus didn't just show up in your story. He invited you into his. He turned you from spectator into participant. And in doing so, gave you back something you didn't know you were missing. Permission to cry at beautiful things, to laugh when no one else does, to dance even when the song is just in your head, to stop demanding that every moment be meaningful and start noticing the ones that are. You step barefoot onto the sand once more, where the tide has begun to roll in again, lazy and confident, like it's sure of its place in the story. And you are too. Not certain, but sure. Because you've met the God of being undone. And you've come out the other side still singing. The sea is rising slowly now, inch by inch, curling around your feet, as if greeting an old friend. The tide's not in a rush. Neither are you. You stand at the water's edge, eyes fixed on the soft horizon where sky and sea blur into one long exhale. There's no spectacle, no final transformation, just the quiet realization you've been transformed enough. Because that's how Dionysus works in the end. He doesn't need you to notice the moment the change happened. He just needs you to carry it, and you will. So let's step back for a moment beyond myth, beyond masks, and ask something that's been waiting patiently beneath every vine, every whisper, every dolphin fin slicing through salt water. Why does this story still matter? It's ancient. It's weird. It's messy. But that's the secret. It still works because we are still weird, still messy, still reaching for the divine with one hand while clutching our fears in the other. We are still chasing order and needing chaos, building walls and hoping someone will knock them down. And Dionysus, he does not come to tidy things up. He comes to make them real. Your final historical fact. Even as Christianity rose and ancient temples fell, Dionysus lingered in back rooms, in whispered songs, in secret rites that never truly disappeared. In the medieval period, he resurfaced in folk traditions and carnival festivals. In modern psychology, he reemerged as an archetype, And today his name still appears in wine labels, in theater troupes, in tattoo ink. His myth never ended because he became a pattern in the human psyche. And your last quirky tidbit, the dolphins, yes, those transformed pirates, are still considered good luck in many Mediterranean cultures. Fishermen tell stories of them guiding lost boats to shore. Locals toss coins into the sea when they see them leap. Somewhere in all that joy is the ghost of a myth. Not angry, not forgotten, just swimming. You crouch at the water now, dipping your hand in, cool, clean, endless. You smile, and for a moment you think you feel it, a laugh, not quite your own, rising in your chest, like bubbles from the deep. Not mocking, not cruel, just inviting. Because Dionysus never really leaves. He's there when your playlist shuffles to the perfect song. He's there when the first sip of wine brings a tear to your eye. He's there when you stop explaining yourself and start living like you mean it. And when the world gets too sharp, too cold, too loud, he's the whisper that says, come dance, come feel, come remember. You rise slowly, not changed but remembered, as if the pieces of you that got scattered in the world have finally caught up again, as if you're whole, not perfect, but whole. And now a breeze moves across the water, soft as breath, curling around your shoulders. The sea sparkles, the sky waits, and the dolphins somewhere just out of sight leap once more, not for spectacle, but for joy. So now, dear listener, the journey has come full circle. The story has been told. The god has danced his final step across our quiet night. Let your breath slow now. Let your body sink into stillness. There is no more searching, no more wondering. Just the gentle truth that you are here, you are safe, and you are held. The waves are soft again. The tide has pulled back, and the sand beneath your feet is firm. The sky no longer burns with stars, but rests in a pale hush, waiting for morning. Let it wait. You've traveled far through shipwrecks and transformations, through forests and festivals, through myth and meaning. You've met a god who wore a smile sharper than a blade and carried a message deeper than a temple. And now it's time to rest. Close your eyes if they aren't closed already. Let the last of the moonlight brush your cheek. Let the silence curl around you like a familiar blanket. There is no performance here, no mask, just you, breathing whole. Somewhere in the sea of dreams, a dolphin still swims, and a god still laughs, not because he needs anything from you, but because joy is its own kind of prayer. You are part of that joy now. So sleep quietly. Sleep deeply. You've earned it. You've danced with the divine.